This is the Menin Gate at Ypres in Belgium. On its walls are engraved the names of 54,000 officers and men from Britain and the Empire who died here during one of the fiercest battles of the First World War. More than 80 years after the war's end, every evening the dead are still honored by playing of the last post. When the war ended in November 1918, even the victorious nations had little to celebrate. Britain had lost nearly 1 million men. France, almost 1.5 million. Up to 2 million Germans had died. No wonder the cry rang round, never again. Everywhere, that is, except in Germany.
Trench fighting is the bloodiest, wildest, most brutal of all. Of all the war's exciting moments, none is so powerful as the meeting of two stormtroop leaders between narrow trench walls. Combat is one of the truly great experiences, and I've yet to find someone for whom the moment of victory was not one of exhilaration.
The Germans liked former soldier Ernst Jünger. The only tragedy was the outcome. The war may have been triggered by a series of accidents, but it soon became clear that for Germany, the war meant everything. A chance for a nation that had only been created in 1871 to come of age, to become an imperial power. Defeat in 1918 was more than a military setback. It was a national catastrophe. For Britain and France, it was the war to end all wars. But for Germany, 1918 would only be the beginning of a titanic struggle to sweep away humiliation and once again achieve domination of Europe. Their chance would come again, and within a generation, it had. The German experience of the First World War would produce not only Adolf Hitler, it produced his politics too. When war broke out in August 1914, there were cheering crowds all over Europe, but nowhere more loudly than in Germany. Until then, it was rare for huge crowds to gather in central Berlin.
August 1914 is one of these extraordinary moments on which people look again and again throughout their lives. You have masses and masses of people who collect around Unter den Linden, reveling in the moment of here is a German cause that will bring Germans of all social classes together.
Many Germans felt this was their country's moment of destiny. This was the nation Bismarck had forged in 1871. A generation later, Germany had become the industrial superpower of Europe. But in 1914, Germany remained a political pygmy. A new nation, jealous of the vast empires of the British and French. By now they had armed forces the equal of their great rivals, and also a plan in place for what they intended to do with that army, a plan designed to see German power conquer Europe. Even school children got swept up in the dream.
Wenn wir in die Schule, in die Turnhalle marschierten, Whenever we filed into school, we carried a black, white and red flag in front of us, the Reich flag. And we sang marching songs, just like soldiers did, because we knew that we would be called up one day. Dying for one's fatherland was the most noble thing that a young man could aspire to.
You could not be more German than when in uniform.
The tradition stems from the founding of the Reich in 1871, and it was the army that had fought the so-called Wars of Unification. And from there on, they felt they were the guardians of the nation, not just guarding frontiers, and guardians of the well-being of the nation.
In Germany, the armed forces called the shots.
The German General Staff operates independently of politics and of diplomacy. It had its own rules, its own plans, its own laws, its own corporate traditions, and it worked as if it were a completely independent corporation. And the problem with Germany was that these plans get completely out of hand.
A huge crowd had also gathered in Munich to cheer the outbreak of war. And there, right in the middle, was one particularly delighted young man, Adolf Hitler.
Overpowered by stormy enthusiasm, I fell down on my knees and thanked heaven from an overflowing heart for granting me the good fortune of being permitted to live at this time. There now began the greatest and most unforgettable time of my earthly existence.
The writer Ernst Junger watched as women garlanded troops in Hanover.
We had left lecture rooms, school benches and work tables. Grown up in a materialistic age, we all longed for the unusual, the great danger. The war had gripped us like an intoxicant.
The teenaged Junger joined up that day. Hitler's future deputy, Rudolf Hess, wrote to his parents,
"Rejoice with me. I am an infantryman. I am firmly resolved to play my part in giving these barbarians and international criminals the thrashing they deserve."
But for those too young to join up, there was only frustration. One 14-year-old prayed the war would last long enough for him to see action, only for it to be over before he was sent to the front. His name was Heinrich Himmler, the future Reichsführer of the SS. He described it as the most disappointing moment of his life. This German nationalism was even more fervent than the jingoism experienced in Britain and France. Ambitions made all the more powerful by new ideas of German superiority gaining ground.
Ewiger Wald, ewiges Volk.
Unlike Britain and France, Germany had no historical empire to base its patriotism on. What it did have, however, were philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, who took the myths and legends of an older, more heroic age and offered them to a generation of young Germans.
Volk steht wie Wald in Ewigkeit.
They had this rather vague pantheism. They wanted to get back to worshipping with the communal spirits of their ancestors. And they had mystic ideas of German nationalism. Germany was a sort of community set apart from other European countries, as well, of course, as other parts of the world, in the sense that Germany had a special mission. And I think they felt that Germany was definitely superior to other nations.
For them, Germany was far more than a country. It was a folk, a people greater than the sum of its parts. What was important was the mystical fellowship of all Germans, Volksgemeinschaft.
The Volksgemeinschaft stands for the unity of the nation achieved through its diversity, so that you incorporate all classes, all social stations under the framework of the nation, and that the most important thing about your neighbor or the fellow next down the street is the fact that he or she is German, and that is what binds you together.
It was a deadly combination, a massive military buildup, supported by mystical notions of German uniqueness and superiority. No wonder then that for many German soldiers, the experience of war was one of both camaraderie and, beyond that, the euphoric sense of being Germans.
The war had taught us one lesson: the great community of the front. All class differences disappeared under its spell. Out there, it was what a person was, not what he seemed to be, that counted. There was only a people, no individuals.
We soldiers who were at the front and in the trenches didn't ask a wounded comrade, "Are you Bavarian or Prussian, Catholic or Protestant?" We experienced the Volksgemeinschaft in the trenches.
Morgenrot, Morgenrot, leuchtet mir zum frühen Tod. Bald wird die Trompete blasen, dann muss ich mein Leben lassen, ich und mancher Kamerad. Ja.
In few places does the belief in sacrificing for Germany come across more clearly than in Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. Hitler waxed lyrical about his first experience of battle as a young private in a Bavarian regiment.
Suddenly, an iron greeting came whizzing at us over our heads, and with a sharp report sent the little pellets flying through our ranks, ripping up the wet ground. But even before the little cloud had passed, from 200 throats, the first hurrah rose to meet the first messenger of death. And from the distance, the strains of a song reached our ears, coming closer and closer, leaping from company to company, and just as death plunged a busy hand into our ranks, the songs reached us, and we passed it along. Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles in der Welt.
For many Germans, such intense feelings would not diminish, even with the horrors and sufferings of the next 4 years. Instead, enthusiasm for the war would reach new heights. Within months of the outbreak of war, the mounting casualty figures had begun to disillusion many on the Allied side. The war poet, John McCrae, wrote,
"We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields."
Its pathos would become for the British the dominant view of the war. To this day, the Great War is regarded as a tragic waste of millions of young lives. The German response to the horror of war was very different. This is Langemarck Cemetery in Belgium. At the cemetery today lie the bodies of 25,000 student volunteers killed in 1914. But the slaughter led not to outrage for the loss of life. On the contrary, it spurred many Germans on to even greater desire to sacrifice themselves for Germany.
Quite early on in the war, a collection of letters was published which became very influential among thinking Germans, intellectual Germans, of officers who'd fallen at the front in battles like Langemarck, in the slaughter of the innocents. And it was their reflections on what the war meant to them as they fought it in the trenches. And the overwhelming impression was that they had sloughed off their naivety and their selfishness, and that they had now put their faith in the achievement of a community rather than in an individual liberation, which had perhaps been their goal before the war. And they now wanted to sacrifice themselves for this rather misty ideal of a Germany, of a new risen nation, tempered by the war.
By 1916, it was clear even these levels of sacrifice were not enough to win the war. Soldiers were dying in their thousands to gain just a few yards of mud. But this did not lead to disillusion with the war. Instead, in Germany, 1916 was the moment the gloves came off. The Kaiser was sidelined. Power shifted to two army generals, Ludendorff and Hindenburg.
Hindenburg and Ludendorff, in effect, established a military dictatorship over Germany. And one result of this was that Germany's war aims became more and more extreme. I think you can draw distinct continuities between German war aims, particularly in the second part of the First World War, and those of the Third Reich. In both cases, you saw an attempt to achieve a vast empire in the East. In the First World War, in fact, Germany conquered much of Poland and sizable chunks of what's now the Ukraine and Western Russia. And there was even some limited attempt at a sort of ethnic cleansing of resettling areas with Germans, the original inhabitants, the Slavs and Jews, being moved off.
On the battlefield, too, there were changes. A new force of elite and ruthless soldiers was formed, the Stormtroopers. They were to have an ominous career later in the century.
The Stormtroopers were designed to get round the tactics which had held up infantry assaults in the First World War. They were fast-moving, small groups of infantry. Typically, rather than rifles, they would have short carbines and grenades and even clubs. They would move fast. They would skirt round opposition, leave them mopping up to the poor bloody infantry following them. And they were consciously considered an elite.
The Stormtroopers enjoyed privileges like longer periods of leave and better food. They wore the coveted silver Death's Head, previously worn only by the aristocratic cavalry. Later, the Death's Head became the symbol of the SS. Their discipline was different from the rest of the army, too. Gone was the German army's obsession with social class. In its place came a rough sort of equality, built around shared dangers, plus a highly personalized loyalty to the commander, or Führer of the unit. Some stormtroopers now regarded themselves as far more than a military elite. Ernst Jünger became a highly decorated stormtrooper captain. To Jünger, the stormtroopers were a new warrior caste, a race of Nietzschean supermen destined to rule Europe.
This is the new man, the storm soldier, the elite of Middle Europe. A completely new race, cunning, strong, and packed with purpose. What first made its appearance openly here in the war will be the axis of the future.
His writings encapsulate the spirit of the stormtroopers, this elite, warriors set apart. He compared them to greyhounds, to fast-moving, wiry, thin, all these images of no fat on them, no flesh. They weren't bourgeois, they were warriors. They were made to fight. They were killing machines. They were, in his view, a new type of man altogether.
It was a powerful premonition for the future. Germany was now waging war with leader-obsessed fighting units, directed by a ruthless military dictatorship. Nowhere were these new tactics better used than in March 1918, when Ludendorff launched a massive offensive against the Allies. Now, Germany smelt victory.
The conviction that the war would end with the victory of Germany after all began to seize the troops. The foe was visibly depressed. A glorious faith flowed again into the hearts of millions.
But even these new tactics would not be enough. For thousands of American troops were arriving in Europe, following the US declaration of war on Germany. This formidable force ensured that the tide began to turn in favor of the Allies.
Beginning with the Second Battle of the Marne at the end of July, and then the British, Australian, Canadian and French attack at Amiens on the 8th of August 1918, a battle that Ludendorff described as the Black Day of the German army. Germany was being beaten.
In November 1918, Germany surrendered. The First World War was over. But the German dreams that had started war were not. The people gathered outside this chapel are here to remember a battle 80 years ago in what is now Western Poland. They are the sons and daughters of Germans who lost their homes in that once German area after the end of the First World War. And every year, they gather to commemorate their loss. For them, even 80 years on, the scars of Germany's defeat run deep. In 1918, the impact of defeat was utterly traumatic. Adolf Hitler was in hospital recovering from a gas attack that had temporarily blinded him when he heard news of the surrender.
It became impossible for me to sit still 1 minute more. Again, everything went black before my eyes. I tottered and groped my way back to the dormitory, threw myself on my bunk, and dug my burning head into my blanket and pillow.
Behind the shock of defeat lay one overriding emotion. The German people, the Volk, had been betrayed. Rudolf Hess had joined the army in the first days of the war. When Hitler became German Chancellor, Hess would be his deputy.
I fought for the honor of our flag, where a man had to fight, where it was the hardest, in the filth and in the mud, in the hell that was Verdun, Artois and other places. And that's all to have been in vain?
Hitler and Hess were far from being alone in the violence of their emotions. For it was hard for most Germans to appreciate that they had actually lost the war. Apart from the Rhineland, there were no Allied troops on German soil.
It's not possible. The Allied armies haven't even come into Germany, that there has been no war in Germany, that war was fought in France. How can one say Germany lost the war? And that's where it all comes from, and that is in fact the origin of Nazi ideology, is this sort of theme that Germany really did not lose the war, and it is a very popular theme because nobody thought that Germany was going to lose the war.
And on the Eastern Front, it was even harder for Germans to accept the war was lost. For here, they had triumphed. In November 1918, Germany was still in possession of the former Russian territories of Poland, the Baltic states, and Ukraine.
The German army was defeated, clearly it was defeated, and the front soldiers saw this, and in their diaries they speak about that they lost. But this was not the general feeling.
It's interesting that shortly after the war was concluded, a senior British official, Sir Eric Geddes, actually visited Germany. And he wrote back to the effect that if only we had known how bad things were in Germany, we might have held out for stiffer terms. I think if the war had gone on for another week or 2 weeks, large chunks of the German army would simply have disintegrated. At the end of that time, it became absolutely clear to everybody the German army had been decisively beaten in the West.
The failure to bring home to Germany the reality of defeat led to the growth of a myth that Germany had not been defeated, but betrayed. A myth born out of a meeting in Berlin, attended by Germany's wartime dictator, General Ludendorff.
Ludendorff happened to meet in a hotel in Berlin a British general, General Malcolm, who was attempting to supervise Germany's compliance with various treaty obligations. And they got to discuss the end of the war. And Ludendorff put forward the claim that the German armies had never been defeated on the battlefield. And Malcolm queried this. He said, "Not defeated? You mean they were stabbed in the back?" And Ludendorff's face brightened up. He said, "Yes, that's it exactly. They were stabbed in the back." And that is how the legend of the stab in the back was born, i.e. that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield and that they had been stabbed in the back by traitors, by pacifists, by strikers, by shirkers, and by the Jews at home.
Millions shared Ludendorff's views. The politicians had betrayed the soldiers. The new democratic government, the Weimar Republic, would be made to pay.
Would not the graves of all the hundreds of thousands open, the graves of those who, with faith in the fatherland, had marched forth never to return? Would they not open and send the silent mud and blood-covered heroes back as spirits of vengeance to the homeland which had cheated them?
The delusion that the German people were somehow betrayed was made worse by the treaty that ended the war, the Treaty of Versailles. In January 1919, the British, French, and American leaders met in France. Their mission was hugely ambitious, not only to devise peace terms to end the war, but to make sure war could never happen again.
The Paris Peace Conference was really this enormous precedent-setting international meeting, and it continued right the way through to August 1920. But it didn't even stop then. It really inaugurated a whole system of conferences that lasted through the 1920s. There were about 30 countries officially represented, but nobody's actually counted the number of delegates who attended. It was a huge affair.
For most Germans, it seemed outrageous. Here were the Allies dictating peace terms, when so many in Germany believed they hadn't even lost.
All of a sudden, in the second week of May, the terms of the Treaty of Versailles are published. Now, when you read the newspapers of that week of mourning, as it was declared by the German Chancellor Ebert, when you look at the newspapers of that single week, you become conscious of the shock that was caused by this realization that perhaps Germany had lost the war. And a lot of people can't believe it.
Germany was meant to feel the pain of defeat. The country was disarmed, some territory confiscated, and it would have to pay billions in reparations. But the final insult was a clause that stipulated Germany's war guilt, forcing Germany to accept the war had been its fault. Many soldiers wanted to carry on fighting, but this time against the Weimar Republic, whose leaders had signed the peace treaty. Former soldier Friedrich Wilhelm Heinz would become a leading Nazi when Hitler took power.
People told us the war was over. That made us laugh. We ourselves are the war. Its flame burns strongly within us. It envelops our whole being and fascinates us with an enticing urge to destroy. We obeyed and marched onto the battlefields of the post-war world just as we had gone into battle on the Western Front, singing, reckless, and filled with the joy of adventure.
The men who'd fought in the First World War, who were debouched back into civil society, came, in a sense, with unique experiences which were difficult to explain to people who hadn't experienced it. And in a sense, they clung together. You know, they retained their group solidarity into peacetime. And moreover, unfortunately, they also continued the idea that they lived in a world of enemies, except this time the enemies were other Germans of a different political persuasion on the street.
The Allies had defeated the German military, that Versailles had failed to destroy German militarism. Instead, Germans seethed with resentment. For all its good intentions, it had been a failure that would make further conflict inevitable.
Versailles is an unsatisfactory halfway house. In other words, it's not punitive enough. It doesn't permanently hobble Germany's national capacity. And on the other hand, it's not generous enough in the way that the post-1945 settlements were with Germany and Japan and with Marshall Aid and so forth. So it's like the worst case. It combines the demerits of both positions. So it isn't harsh enough and it's not restorative enough.
In Britain and France, the mood had turned away from war.
Britain was traumatized by the war. She had lost between 800 and 900,000 men. You know, there were these awful scenes in London's railway stations when stretchers were just lined up of wounded men waiting to be taken to hospital. France was traumatized by the war. France lost 1.4 million men. The slogan in 1918 was "Jamais plus," never again. But Germany had no pacifists. What happens in Germany is that a cult of the soldier develops, and the cult of the soldier is one of sacrifice. How can we put Germany back in a position of dominance? That's not the same thing at all.
Nowhere was this difference more obvious than in the attitude to the classic book and film of the interwar years, All Quiet on the Western Front, written by the German author Erich Maria Remarque.
In France and in Britain, that book was read as a pacifist novel. It ends with a German reaching for a butterfly and he dies. But in Germany, All Quiet on the Western Front is read as a book of sacrifice, and it is a book about the cult of the soldier. So you have both Germans, British and French reading the same book, but they're reading it in a different way.
These feelings erupted in the formation of right-wing paramilitary groups of ex-soldiers called the Freikorps. For them, the fighting was far from over. The battle now was aimed inwards against those Germans they considered traitors. First the communists, who had seized power in Berlin and Munich. Later the Jews would also find themselves demonized as enemies of the folk. On Germany's borders, Germans and Poles fought for control of disputed territory. The parents of the people gathered here formed the Freikorps Oberland and fought against the Poles for control of Silesia. The Freikorps would form a direct link between the trenches, the post-war world, and the Nazis.
I decided that I simply had to be part of it. This was a result of my nationalist education, the ideas that had been drummed into me as a 10-year-old. You thought that anyone who wasn't a soldier was a second-class citizen. I thought that I should enlist in the Oberland, which I did.
The Freikorps were organized along the same principles as the stormtrooper units, a community of equals, a Volksgemeinschaft, but owing personal allegiance to a charismatic commander, or Führer.
The Freikorps were composed of two elements. There was the old soldier element who'd been through the horrors and the hells of the First World War, who'd got militarism in their blood, and who couldn't get the trenches out of their system, and they wanted to carry on.
Rudolf Hess was one of these old soldiers. He joined the Freikorps in Munich and took part in the bloody restoration of order in which thousands were killed. These old soldiers were joined by younger men, too.
The other main constituent of the Freikorps were the young student generation who'd seen their elder brothers go off to war and wanted a slice of the action themselves.
One of these young men was the future SS leader, Heinrich Himmler. In 1919, he joined a paramilitary unit in Munich.
Today I have my uniform on, once again. It is, as always, quite my favorite dress.
For Himmler, the Weimar Republic had betrayed the mood of August 1914, when Germans were united. Now, the soldiers would seek revenge. For the ex-soldiers of the First World War, who thought their sacrifice had been in vain, the road to revenge would be a rocky one. Germany was riven by poverty and civil unrest. A failed coup attempt in the early 1920s had spelled the end of the Freikorps. Meanwhile, ex-corporal Adolf Hitler was languishing in prison after a botched attempt by the fledgling Nazi Party to overthrow the Bavarian government. It seemed the democratic Weimar Republic was not going to be overthrown that easily. Yet whatever the setbacks for the German right, a hankering after the old days was never far below the surface.
The greatest thing that a person can risk is his life. So soldiers were worshipped as heroes. And in the poems we would recite at school and at patriotic evenings, German evenings, heroism was described in even more exalted terms.
The Freikorps baton was taken up by another organization, also formed by ex-soldiers, the Stahlhelm, or steel helmets. A sort of German equivalent to the British Legion, the Stahlhelm was enormously powerful. Millions flocked to their German days and other patriotic events, such as the unveiling of statues to the fallen heroes of the war. Slowly, however, extreme right-wing parties were capturing the imagination of the post-war generation.
A person's father might have been a social democrat, but his son was a Hitler supporter. I remember, for example, boys lying on their stomachs on the floor, studying the Nazi newspaper, while their father sat at the table reading the Social Democrat newspaper.
Long before the Nazi breakthrough, the traditional nationalist parties are in ruins. They don't know how to approach voters. Voters won't come to their rallies. Voters won't vote for them. They're really old-fashioned remnants. And it is groups like the Steel Helmet, the Young German Order, and countless smaller groups that break the back of the non-socialist parties.
Even so, it's possible that the Nazis would have remained on the lunatic fringe of German politics had it not been for economic disaster. In 1929, the Wall Street Stock Exchange collapsed, throwing the world into economic depression. Nowhere was harder hit than Germany. Millions were thrown out of work. The economic crisis finally discredited the parties of the Weimar Republic, leading to the collapse of democracy in Germany.
The Weimar Republic was always going to have a difficult time in being accepted by the German people, but it might just have survived had it not been for the Great Depression. And the Depression, in turn, I think, more than any other single factor, brought about the rise of Hitler.
The crisis thrust Hitler and the Nazi Party into the limelight.
A fire was kindled from whose flame one day the sword must come which would regain freedom and life for the German nation. I sensed that the goddess of inexorable vengeance for the deed of November 1918 was striding forth.
In the elections of 1930, their vote increased dramatically, from 12 seats in the Reichstag 2 years before to 107 now. That same year, Hitler's personal photographer Heinrich Hoffmann was sitting in a cafe. showing Hitler pictures he'd taken of the cheering crowds in Munich at the outbreak of war in 1914.
Germans talk constantly about August 1914. Where were you on that day? And it must have been such a discussion between Hitler and his personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann. And they're talking about the war. They're talking about the war experience. They're talking about August 1914. And suddenly Hitler owns up, yeah, I was on the Odeonsplatz on the 2nd of August. I was right there among those masses. This was my formative political moment when I declared my loyalty to the great German cause. And Heinrich Hoffmann says, well, and I was there too. I took photographs of that very meeting. And so Hoffmann rushes back to his studio, goes frame by frame by frame through all the photographs that he has of August 1914. And lo and behold, there he finds, with a magnifying glass, what looks eerily like Hitler right in the middle of the crowd. And that's Hitler.
Hitler had sought to portray himself as the man representing Germany's heroic war dead. World War I would once again dominate German politics.
The Nazi movement sell themselves as being somehow representing the dead, and Hitler personally, in a way, characterizes himself as like the unknown soldier, but he's got down from the plinth and he's walking around. He's Mr. Average who had this terrible experience.
The photo was a propaganda godsend. The Nazis quickly reproduced it as a postcard and distributed thousands of copies. It would be August 1914 all over again. A nation united around the dream of greatness. This time, the heady feeling of togetherness would be as ecstatic as ever. Only this time, not everyone would belong.
The spirit of the soldiers fighting at the front is the spirit we need in our people's time of emergency. This spirit will bring a new, happy future for the defeated and those deceived by a conspiracy of international Jews.
In January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Now that the Nazis were in power, the dead soldiers of World War I would walk again. Hitler promised bringing Germans together would be the answer to her problems once more.
One of the great purposes of National Socialist policy was to let individual Germans visualize their role and their incorporation into the great Volksgemeinschaft. And in many ways, what the National Socialists are trying to do is recreate this moment of August 1914 permanently.
Nowhere was this better illustrated than by the films of Leni Riefenstahl, and in particular her classic, Triumph of the Will, the film of the 1934 Nazi Party rally at Nuremberg. Thousands had attended the rally, and thousands more, seeing the film, would be ravished by a vision of the German folk brought together under one leader.
In the movie theaters, they suddenly see their incorporation in the Volksgemeinschaft. The film serves as a means of recognition that, yes, I was there, I'm part of this.
Woher stammst du? Aus Friesenland. Und du, Kamerad? Vom Kaiserstuhl. Aus Pommern.
So you have these young men saying, you know, here I am, I'm from East Prussia, I'm from Silesia, I'm from the Rhineland, in a way choreographing the unity of the nation in the harmony of all its different parts, again and again and again. It's a very aesthetic politics.
Ein Volk, ein Führer, ein Reich, Deutschland!
Now Hitler was ready to revenge Germany's humiliation of 1918. In May 1940, German forces poured into the Low Countries and France. Once again, Belgium was under German occupation. Hitler wasted no time in reminding Germans that this war was being fought to avenge the memory of the fallen soldiers of the First. Albert Gequier was then 6 years old. His family had a German sergeant billeted with them.
Today, after the exercise, he says to my father, tomorrow we have a high visit. Says my father, is it a general or a minister that comes? Nein, it's the Maler that comes, the painter.
The painter was the soldier's nickname for Hitler, who'd once tried to become an artist. 24 years before, in October 1916, at the height of the fighting on the Western Front, the young army private Adolf Hitler had been wounded in battle. He was brought here to be treated in a field hospital based in the crypt of the church. Now he was back, his visit a pilgrimage to the battlefields of his youth.
My mother and myself, we walked to the church and we saw all this movement, these German soldiers and lorries and guns, and this big Mercedes, this big car. I looked there and they came over to the church. The officers came out, the lorries, and greet and salute them, you know, the Führer, and they comes on the church. And he saluted us when he came on the road.
Afterwards, Hitler went on to the nearby cemetery at Langemark, where the flower of German youth had been cut down in 1914. Hitler's visit to the former battlefields of the Western Front was a visit whose symbolism was understood by every German back home. When Hitler returned to Berlin, he was greeted by millions of adoring Germans. For those crushed into the square below the Reichschancellery, it must have seemed that August 1914 had been born again. But this time, there would be no mistakes. Neither enemies within, nor Germany's rivals abroad would be allowed to crush Germany's world-conquering patriotic fervor.
Season continues with horror on the home front, Thursday at 9 here on 4. Next tonight, it's horror in a town on the Mexican border. Clint Eastwood is the enigmatic man with no name looking for a fistful of dollars.